we have a situation where people are just, in families in San Francisco, we have over 2,000 homeless families in San Francisco alone. Over 2,000.
Wow.
And families are moving from shelter to shelter to shelter to hotel to shelter. And the impacts on children is devastating. It's incredibly, destabilizing. It has impacts on their education, on their nutrition, but also has developmental aspects. We talk about families who are living in a small room where there's physically no space for the children to roll around. They don't meet their developmental milestones. So when the babies are 9 months, they're supposed to be, rolling over, crawling, these different things are supposed to be happening, and they're not. They're actually developmentally delayed because of the really small space that there's physically no place to move around.
Oh, it's just awful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when you think about multi-billionaires continuing to get richer, it's mind-boggling, the disparities. I would like you to talk about our mayor, uh, Gavin Newsom, and his Care Not Cash program.
Yeah, well, this is a program that Mayor Newsom basically got elected on the first time around, which, from many of our perspectives, it was on the backs of homeless people who were receiving cash assistance, whose backs were already sore from sleeping on the sidewalk. And what happened to them is they lost about 85% of their income. They were offered shelter beds, and whether they took it or not, their income was decreased by the 85%. There was thousands of people that lost benefits altogether who we don't know what happened to. And then what's happening today, we've been able to get some people into housing. We already had a housing program, but basically they had to take away three people's checks in order to house one person. And now the housing's gone.
And excuse me, but when you say people's checks, is that general assistance?
General assistance checks, yeah.
Okay.
So they're welfare checks, yeah.
And
so
what do they average about?
They are run between the mid 300s to 400 and some odd dollars a month.
In the most expensive city in the country.
Yeah, so it's a struggle. But if you're homeless, and then your check is decreased to about $70 a month. So, so what happens is that now, kind of speeding up to today after the program has gotten implemented. Of course, there's no more housing. The housing fund that Care Not Cash created by cutting people off of assistance is now run dry. And so we have an increasing number of people who are on public assistance that are homeless, that are being offered shelter beds. And as more and more shelter beds are offered to them and set aside for that population, the rest of the population utilizing the shelter gets displaced. So people with disabilities, veterans, folks who are working. And so one of the issues is that, of course, whether the person uses the bed or not under Care Not Cash, they still get the shelter bed. So we end up having, on average, about 50 people that we've been able to track per day are turned away seeking shelters. And then the mayor announces over and over again that he's got these empty shelter beds in the shelters. So, of course, they're empty but not available because no one can use them. And what that does is open the door for the only people who are left on the street or choosing to be on the street. So we call in the police.
Oh. And speaking of the police, let's talk about the citations that homeless people are subjected to on a daily basis.
Yeah, so if you're without housing, you get tickets. If you're sleeping for camping, they range between about $70 to $130. If you're unable to pay, if you're unable to pay, it of course goes to warrant. You get several tickets, and people do jail time. We're actually jailing people for being too poor to afford a place to live. And that also happens with panhandlers. So we've had this, Mayor Newsom passed an initiative with the voters that for aggressive panhandling, which basically is defined as asking for money twice, get a ticket, and there's jail time associated with that as well. And so what we're seeing is since Newsom the first year that Newsom was elected, in his first term, twice as many tickets were given to homeless people than the last year of the Willie Brown administration. To date, since Newsom took office, he's given out about 48,000 tickets to homeless people have been given out under Newsom. And
so what happens if they can't afford to pay the tickets?
Yeah, so if they're lucky enough to get representation, and so we offer that to we're able to hook up representation for people for about 10% of the population, and most of those get dismissed because, of course, they're improperly given. And for the other folks, it goes to warrant, and they end up with this criminal record situation. And what that means is if they're on the waiting list for housing authority, for affordable housing, if their name comes up on the list, they do a criminal check, they see you got a warrant, and you're tossed off the list. We've had people come into our office after waiting for 8 years for housing, only to be tossed off for a camping ticket. Or, alternatively, they can lose their disability benefits. And I had a gentleman come into my office the other day that happened to.
This is criminal.
It really is. And what we're also doing to do this, which is all kind of a whole big runaround that we're giving people, is we're spending about $6 million to do it. So to criminalize people instead of simply, putting people in housing. And we're actually also spending more money to keep people homeless than we would if we would have put them into housing, because of course human beings are not meant to live outdoors. So the health consequences of living outdoors are really dramatic for people. Your cold turns into pneumonia, your wound turns into lost limbs. That's why when you walk around in poor neighborhoods, you almost have the image of being in a third world country. I mean, people are in such poor physical health,
Right.
and that is because they're living outside.
Right. And let's talk about the fatalities from homelessness.
So yeah, I mean, for folks who are living outside, which their life expectancy is going to be much shorter than people who are housed. And so we had last year, the city no longer tracks it for political reasons. They used to do a study, which was helpful because we could look at all these preventable deaths and then make policy recommendations and say, these are the areas that we need to change. And because that ended up giving the city some bad publicity for having so many people die on the streets, they cut the study, stopped doing it. But we know just from having our memorial every year where people bring names to the memorial of people they've known who died on the streets over the past year, that in 2007 about 140 people died without
On
a
the
place
streets.
on the streets without a place to
One of the richest
Yeah.
cities in the world.
Yeah, and they may have died.
Incredible.
They may not have died specifically on the streets. They could have died in a hospital. But the point is that they had no place to call home, and many did die on the streets. But they had no place to call home at the time of
Exactly.
death, which is
And some homeless people are attacked.
yeah. There's definitely a lot of that, and we had actually, and I'm a Mission District resident, and one of our residents died in that way in 2007, who seemingly was a victim of a hate crime. Where he was hit numerous times with a baseball bat and ended up fatally dying in the middle of the night.
And I think that's directly attributable to the fact that this system and this media fosters contempt for poor people.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think you can only pick up the Chronicle and read the newspaper and see how real that is. People are, because they're poor and because they're too poor to afford a place to live, are equated with trash. They're equated with dirt. They talk about cleaning up the city or sweeping the streets. They're talking about homeless people. They're called bums. They're assumed to all be mentally ill. And then, of course, that in a very derogative way in terms of assuming that they're violent because of their psychiatric disability.